G'day folks, welcome to our discussion on ancient Rome here today. We're going to take a look at the geography of Rome first and how this empire came to be because of its geography, and then talk about the formation of what comes to be called the Roman Republic and some of the characteristics of the government, but also Roman society and culture, and then we'll talk about how Rome became an empire. Later on, we'll talk about Rome, the Roman Republic declining, and then much later on the empire itself declining, as we'll see it fall apart in somewhat similar ways to the way that the Han Dynasty in China also fell apart. Some of the terms that we'll be looking into here. But let's start off with the Roman geography. Rome, like in Greece, really started as a small city-state. But interestingly, it stretched from being a small city-state to taking over the entirety of the Mediterranean, parts of northern Africa, all through Europe, all the way up into Britain. Became a major empire. But nonetheless, because of its strategic location in the heart of the Mediterranean, obviously this helped out with expansion. And Rome was, or rather Italy, I guess, was easier to unify than Greece, because Italy it's still hilly, it's still, has some ups and downs, but it's not nearly as mountainous as, say, Greece. So it's not broken up into these small isolated valleys like Greece is, and it's much less rugged as well. So the people of Italy, of the Italian peninsula, Rome's ancestors, the Latins, probably came in around 850 BCE along the Tiber River and created these small villages. And later they eventually created what is called Rome, which is a city on 7 hills, which is also why we have Rome, Georgia. They named it because it is on 7 hills. But anyway, you had other inhabitants there as well. Eventually the Romans took over the Etruscans and various other groups and even adopted the Etruscan gods in some of their architecture. And the Romans established, at least by their time, what you would call a republic, basically electing representatives to represent the entirety of the country. And the most powerful of the bodies to run the show was the Senate. The thing is that all the members of the Senate were patricians, all 300 of them. In other words, they were the ones who held the land, held the wealth, held the prestige. So at most, these guys were like 1% of Roman society, right? And they got to serve for life, and they made all the laws. Now, they would eventually, once there were some uprisings, some disagreements from the plebeians, or the average people, so we get the term plebe, eventually we started to see the plebeians get some say in the government, and getting to actually have some folks serve and have some say in the government. But overall, really, the patricians really continued to hold power. One of the great examples in Roman history of this republic and republican attitude is that of Cincinnatus. The way it used to work was the Senate, in a time of war, would actually select a dictator, basically one guy to take charge and call all the shots, because it's an emergency situation, maybe you've been invaded, so you need one guy making decisions fast. Well, one of these guys, a couple of times, was a guy named Cincinnatus, and actually the city in Ohio is named after this guy, and it was actually named that because of, in the 18th century and early 19th century, there was actually a military sort of a club or group there that named themselves Cincinnatus after this guy, and the name stuck for the city. Nonetheless, basically what the Roman Republic would do is they would grant power to rule for about 6 months. The problem is, usually when somebody is elected a dictator, they tend not to stop wanting to be the dictator. That being said, Cincinnatus on 2 different occasions actually came out, was the dictator, got the army together, took out the invaders, and then what did he do? He returned right back to his farm. And you see there in the statue Cincinnatus holding the fasces. The fasces, we'll see this again in the 20th century in a much different context. But to the ancient Romans, the fasces, or a bundle of sticks, represented peace. But when you put an axe through the fasces, that's representative of what they called the decapitation power. In other words, the person holding the fasces with the axe, he maintains the peace and maintains the peace through authority and violence if necessary. But point being is that Cincinnatus was one of these guys who was actually willing to surrender his power after his elected mission was over, which is very unusual for people to surrender power. But as I said earlier, eventually the plebeians, the farmers, the commoners, the average Joe, the Cletuses, eventually, they seek more say in government. They rise up and this type of thing. So eventually, basically, the patricians did a few things. They actually created a set of laws on tablets that were set up in the forum, in the marketplace where people would trade. So this is very similar to Hammurabi. Now this was done in 450 BC. Hammurabi is a good 1,300 years before this. But nonetheless, it's the same idea. Let people know what the laws are so that anytime justice is carried out, it doesn't seem arbitrary or basically, at the whims of whatever the situation is. Instead, we have laws and everyone knows the laws and how they will be enforced. And eventually the plebeians do gain a little bit more power as we roll into the 400s and 300s BCE. They get to elect these tribunes, some of their local officials, to protect their interests. And eventually these tribunes, could even get a little bit more power and say to try to protect their peoples. But eventually, even the Senate itself is going to be forced to open up to the plebeian class. So what was life like in Roman society? Well, the male was the head of the household. We see this over and over again, and held complete power. And the wife was basically under his rule. She was subject to his authority. Any money that she made, essentially went to him. But he also was responsible for taking care of her and not being abusive or anything like that. That being said, women did have a role. Women did have some, relatively speaking, freedoms in Roman society. They could open up their own business, even though most worked at home, raising the family, but they could also, spin thread and weave things and make some money off of that. And eventually, patrician women actually, managed to actually go outside and actually were welcomed into society. Though, for a Roman patrician man, if he were, to kiss his wife in public or something like that, he would be chastised for that. Women could get a divorce and vice versa in Roman society, but the children always went to the husband. We're going to see the same thing in European society. Then it'll be transferred over to the Americas in the 17 and 1800s. In the 16, 1700s. And of course, women, they weren't permitted to drink alcohol either. So there are a lot of checks on women, though relative to, say, ancient Babylon or even Greece, they at least had some freedoms, which they deserved. And Rome's a different place. We got some things here about how the Romans thought and how they viewed society and viewed one another. Just a little FYI here for you. So, like actors weren't viewed as being in very high esteem in Rome, as you can see there. Any man who showed his love or affection for his wife, he was kind of ostracized, booted out of society. He was kind of cowardly for showing any affection toward his wife. One senator actually lost his seat for just embracing his wife in public. If you were a noble man or just a man essentially in Rome, you were duty bound to avenge any humiliation suffered by your father. You were expected to get even with other people. Owning people, killing people was just kind of natural to the Romans. In terms of children, infants, fathers could just, if they didn't like their infant child, because it was female, they would just toss that infant into the dung heap in the village. Because it's female or it's sick or, it's another mouth to feed. Eventually, Rome has some laws that say basically, look, now, okay, here's how we're going to deal with this. The father has to invite 5 neighbors to examine the baby before death. Still, it's still just this terrible, terrible practice. but this was just the normal course of life for the Romans. Children themselves weren't considered actually even to be human, whatever that was to the Romans, until they walked and talked. And you can see the cure for a stomach ache there. If your stomach's hurting, just drink some water off somebody has soaked their feet in it. Soap. How about some olive oil and a scraping tool? Toilet paper? Well, that's a stick with a wet sponge. Once Augustus takes over as the first really emperor of Rome, and the republic comes to an end and the empire begins, he would hold all these games in honor of the quote-unquote gods, which of course was really a way for the government to make money. But I mean, it would be commonplace to head out to the Colosseum and watch some of these wild beasts, duke it out with each other. Packs of wild dogs versus deer, bears versus bulls, lions versus tigers, rhinos versus elephants. And then, in the afternoon, it would be animals versus humans. Now, this isn't going to be until the Colosseum's built, which is sometime, after Augustus, but nonetheless, at these, public events. And sadly, once Christianity is developed, as we roll into the 30s, 40s, 50s CE and on, Christians often would be the ones who were persecuted and attacked, typically having animals attack them during these events. And just, another weird factoid for you, for girls to be engaged, you had to be at least 10 years old. One of Julius Caesar's wives was actually 11. Yeah. How about their diet and attire, what they wore? Jellyfish, I hear that's pretty good. Some peacock and ostrich and pork. Fungus is always good, as a little side dish there on the side. The wealthy, if you were wealthy, you'd hold huge banquets that might last the entire day. And if you were a guest there and you ate yourself too full, well, you make sure that you go ahead and force yourself to puke all that out so that, you can go back and keep eating. Got to eat more food. Only if you were a citizen could you actually wear a toga. And these togas were pretty darn big, typically 18 feet by 6 feet. It was a big old wool cloth carefully draped and wrapped around the body. A properly wrapped toga required no buttons, pins, clasps, or any other fastening device. If you knew how to wrap on the toga, then you wore it proud. Men of prestige would wear a white toga with a purple stripe. If you were the emperor, you wore an entirely purple toga. And here you see the Colosseum, which is going to be constructed later on in the Roman Empire, where there will be lots of these events. And you can see underneath the guts here of the Colosseum where essentially gladiators, these soldiers expected to come out and fight and entertain the people in the Colosseum, would prepare, and animals would be held down here as well. In terms of education, well, both boys and girls learned to write. So, this is kind of like Banzhao with the Han Dynasty, writing, around 100 CE, pointing out that boys and girls should be allowed education. Well, in Rome, that was the case. Even if you were poor, you might have access to education. And boys, of course, were always groomed for political careers, right? They're trained in rhetoric. In other words, speaking politically argumentative language. Parents could hire tutors, very similar to what we might have today in that regard. And in terms of religion, Roman gods basically were knockoffs of the Greek gods, and they would hold festivals to honor the gods, put up temples, statues, and all that jazz. So the Roman government is able to conquer all of Italy by about 270. And of course, the big issue here is that, the generals and the officers, the guys in charge, they were the patrician class. But of course, the soldiers are the plebeians. It's always the poor folks fighting the rich man's war in the Roman Empire. Well, this is just before the empire, but nonetheless, in the Roman government. And, at the beginning, you had to supply your own weapons. You might be drafted, but then you have to figure out what you're going to fight with. But at the same time, because of the Roman creed of loyalty and courage and respect for authority, if you were called up to fight, it's just what you did. There was no question. you could be punished, harshly if you, were to retreat from the battlefield or anything like that. It could actually lead to a tenth of the entire unit for which you're fighting being put to death. That being said, they did treat the Romans, once we get into the Empire era, they did treat, most people with justice, the lands where they conquered. It's somewhat similar, I guess, to what we saw with Persia under Darius in the BCE era. As long as you acknowledge that, hey, Romans are in charge, you pay your taxes, you supply some soldiers, the Romans are going to treat you okay. Then you could keep your own customs, you could run your own economy, have your own local government, whatever you want. Some groups would even receive citizenship. And of course, what the Roman government would do is post soldiers throughout its vast empire just to keep order. And the other big thing, though, that the Romans do is the construction of roads, because all these roads, and the Romans were very good at building roads and aqueducts. This is going to link the empire together, and eventually is going to help with allowing for the gospel to spread because of the roads. Well, eventually what happens is the nephew of Julius Caesar is going to end up becoming emperor, Octavian, and he takes upon himself the title Augustus. And after Julius Caesar and his relatively brief dictatorship, basically Octavian, or who becomes Augustus, basically ends up winning this kind of civil war where he defeats Mark Antony and others, and is able to basically become the dictator, even though he's not called the dictator, he's the dictator. And basically, he creates this empire. Now, of course, he makes sure that he is known as the princeps, or the first citizen. He's not supposed to be the king or the dictator, even though, well, he's a dictator. And basically, this ends the Roman Republic and begins the era of what we call the Roman Empire in the 20s BCE. And Augustus Caesar, or Augustus as he'll be called, he's very creative. He's kind of a germ freak too, but he's very creative, institutes a lot of reforms and improvements. And basically his rule begins what we call the Pax Romana, the great era of peace in the Roman Empire, at least for Romans. Well, Augustus, he had a lot of policies, land grants and bonuses if you retired as a veteran, so basically treating soldiers a little bit better. The creation of these aqueducts to provide water to towns and major, relatively speaking, metropolitan areas. But also financing the gladiatorial contests, sometimes from his own purse, which of course was the people's purse. But people would love to come out and see these gladiatorial events. And, he ended the idea of, forcefully taking supplies or money from people arbitrarily. But the other thing he does is he gets rid of the Senate and just sets up one-man rule as the first citizen. So the Roman government itself really changes under Augustus. The whole idea of worshiping the emperor begins. By the time we get to the 3rd century, CE, hundreds of years after Augustus is gone, you have Western provinces thinking that there's a god king, kind of like how the Egyptians would have viewed their pharaoh, 1,500, 2,000 years before this. More professional bureaucracy is created with provincial officials and things like this, similar to what we saw with the Han, but without the civil service exam. And about 1/5 of all the males in the Roman Empire, they're conscripted. In other words, they're forced to serve in the military. And just to give you an idea of the extent of the Roman Empire, they're not playing around here. This is a massive empire, but also very similar to what you would have seen in terms of scope of land and territory owned, very similar to what the Han had. And I'd like to point out Hadrian's Wall. Emperor Hadrian built this thing, 122 CE. Up there, you can see it up in northern Britain, around today what we call Scotland, just to keep out the, of course, barbarians, as they would have called any outsiders, just like the Chinese did. But it just gives you an idea of not only the extent of the Roman Empire, but also the issues that they faced on their frontiers. And here you can see remnants of Hadrian's Wall today. That's just kind of cool. And what a beautiful picture. So basically, a little over 200 years, we have this Pax Romana. Sometimes they call it the Pax Augusta after Augustus. And basically, this era of peace and peacefulness also marks this era of a kind of golden age. So a golden age with the Han, we have a golden age with the Romans. And basically, yeah, there's plenty of war and fighting and combat. The Romans are plundering and conquering. But for the most part, Rome is pretty much free of being invaded, and they're free of social uprisings for the most part. And Roman rule expanded for, 2 million square miles. That is a lot of territory. And basically, we get this kind of time of happiness, this Pax Romana, time of peace, more roads and harbors, irrigation, so you can grow more crops, and aqueducts, people drinking water. Yes, they still like that. And citizenship, basically to everyone who was, within the confines of the border, or of the borders of the frontier. Even slaves declined, even though slaves were very much part of the Roman economy, necessary to the Roman economy, relatively speaking, from their perspective. But even women came to be allowed to own property. They could get a divorce. So basically, what the Romans do, and of course, as you saw on the map earlier, they conquer Greece, right? That becomes part of their empire. Basically, they complete the trend of what we call cosmopolitanism and universalism from the Hellenistic age. The Hellenistic age referring to the era of Alexander the Great, conquering large swaths of territory and spreading Greek culture, or Hellenis, as the Greeks were called, Hellenic culture, which also caused this kind of unity and almost a first sort of globalization, using that term loosely. So basically, this kind of world community that developed, broke down nations. In other words, different types of people or different groups of peoples, bringing them into one single empire. And the Romans developed a system of law that, applied to everyone, and brought about this whole idea of citizenship, that you are a citizen, that you are a member, that you belong to a particular political entity. And basically, they brought stability and order for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, from Britain all the way down to Northern Africa, all the way out to Eastern Europe. And as you can see here, you have all this trade. Of course, you can't have all this trade unless you have roads. So you can see all the numerous items up for trade here, and that obviously the Roman Empire was a major trade nexus, with things coming in and out through Rome right there at the heart of the entire empire. Notice as well, major slave trade going on too. And this is, CE 200, so Christianity would have been very much well developed by this juncture, being spread, and the roads running through even Northern Africa, and then obviously into Greece, where a lot of Christians escaped persecution as well, and spreading the gospel through all of these places. So the cities during the Pax Romana, there are a couple thousand of them. So Rome's pretty advanced, and they had a lot of autonomy in terms of just dealing with local politics. Getting their own local officials and dealing with local matters, and basically these cities, because of the metropolitan nature of them, and because of people coming together, this helps to inaugurate, not only ideas of civilization, but also the influence of Greek culture coming into these places that are now linked by a common Roman Empire. Slavery in Rome did decline over the course of time as people became more individually wealthy. And there were a lot of laws came out to actually protect slaves as the empire went on, and a lot of slaves were very skilled. So once they were manumitted or freed, manumission meaning given freedom, they could go out and get a job. Of course, they'd have to give a percentage of their future earnings to their owner. But if you have a skill set, you could perhaps gain freedom. And here you see an aqueduct that you see there on the right, just this amazing structure that for miles and miles has a slope, a descending slope to bring water from a higher point to a lower point. Simply amazing. Here you see an aqueduct in what the Romans would have called Gaul, and today what we call France. This thing was built around 50 CE, so this thing's almost 2,000 years old, and it is still there. And other major Roman innovations include roads. Roads were huge, but also, ideas of science with Ptolemy, believing that the earth is round. The Greeks before the Romans also believed this. You had a guy named Galen, who was around in the CE era, 129, 216, you can see there. This guy actually advanced medical theories, including the theory of the four humors. He believed, and this just became pretty common practice for another, 1,200 years, 1,300 years at least, that the body was made up of four humors, four substances: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. And the idea was that these things must be kept in order within the human body, and if they're not, or I'm sorry, not order, but in balance, and if they're not kept in balance, this is what explains sickness. So this leads to practices like bloodletting, for example. If they thought that perhaps you had too much of the humor blood in you, then you had to drain some of it. And speaking of how long this lasted, George Washington on his deathbed, in 1790s, they were, taking blood out of his body. Now, of course, we all know that you need blood in order to survive. It carries antibodies and nutrients and everything else. But this whole four humor theory, they believed they had to keep these things in balance. The Romans also had some major innovations in architecture, as you've seen. Obviously, the roads and the aqueducts, as you saw, but also vaults and domes, arches, all kinds of engineering feats, amphitheaters. These guys were very, very advanced, and you have to have advances in transportation technology in order to maintain such a huge empire. Well, as with all empires, the Romans do begin to fall apart. As we roll into the 200s, we start to see the Visigoths begin to invade into the Roman Empire. The Visigoths coming out of Spain, but also even out of northern Africa, and as well as the Hun. The Hun are always coming in, it seems like, but they're coming out of Asia. So we have all these invasions, also these so-called Germanic invasions, the Franks, who really are, well, more Frank as we would think of them today, but also the Goths and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, who were coming out of Germanic speaking areas, invading into the eastern portions of the Roman Empire, and play a significant role in the fall of the Western Roman Empire itself. Eastern portions as in, well, we haven't shared with you yet, but Rome actually ended up being split. I'll talk about it here in a second. But these so-called barbaric tribes, as the Romans would have called them, come in and contribute to the downfall of the empire, very much like what we saw with the Han. And obviously we see prices beginning to get too high, a lot of inflation. The coinage, they create more coins, which causes a debasement of the currency. In other words, to debase it means the base of it is becoming weaker. So in other words, it's losing value. Agricultural production begins to decline as more and more people begin to kind of look out for themselves. You have plague outbreaks. You have people basically moving out of the cities. The cities become too unstable and too ridden with disease and everything else. So people begin to move out. Now, of course, they didn't know what disease was. All they know was, hey, that guy next to me just died and he has some nasty stuff on him. I should probably get away. Regardless, people moving out to the country estates, getting away. Well, in 312 CE, Constantine actually converted to Christianity. And when Constantine did this, and he actually ends up moving the seat of the empire over to Constantinople, which today is Istanbul, once he does this, this becomes a Christian empire. But nonetheless, You have a lot of religious fervor increasing in the Roman Empire. People turning to various faiths, including Christianity, but also various other cultish faiths as well. And you start to see a decline in the quality of the Roman soldier, poor leadership. Like I said, famine and plague breaking out. Trade actually begins to decline, and distant cities that are distant, at least from Rome, like in Britain, modern day London, modern day Paris, Madrid, these places, Berlin, these places are just abandoned. They're left to their own devices. Well, going back before Constantine, a guy named Diocletian, and I always remember this because Diocletian dies in two. He actually split the empire into two parts back in 284, and he did this because the empire was just too big. So basically, he split it pretty much down the center and set up seats of government in modern-day Turkey and obviously in Rome. But once Constantine came in and converted to Christianity in 312, he moved the seat of the empire over to Constantinople, which today is Istanbul. And basically now, this kind of East Roman Empire begins to develop, and eventually this would be the Byzantine Empire, which we'll talk about later on. Nonetheless, by 410 CE, a Visigoth general, Alaric, actually overruns Italy. He comes into Rome. He actually, takes over briefly. And then by 476, we get more Hunnic invasions. Odoacer, a German, basically overthrows the Roman emperor in the west. He actually takes the empress hostage. So basically, Western Rome falls into disarray. It's done. It's toast after 476, leaving only the Eastern Empire, Byzantium. But Byzantium is going to last for another 1,000 years, actually until 1453, until it is overthrown by Islam. But nonetheless, some of the other things, obviously invasions, the Visigoths coming in, all these different groups coming in, Attila the Hun overrunning a lot of Europe, the Vandals, yet another of these quote-unquote barbaric groups, all overrunning this Roman Empire to finally bring it down by 476. And you can see here, just looking at the map, there's a few groups invading into Rome there, so you can imagine why they had so many issues. And you can see here on this map the formal division of Rome. And the green there, that will become the Byzantine Empire, which will last for another 1,000 years. The Western Empire will fall into disarray. And basically, it's going to leave things open for the so-called barbarians to basically work things out for themselves and develop their own longer lasting empires. So Constantine, just an aside here for Christianity, Constantine is the one. But it's important to talk a little aside here on Constantine, who basically, helped to bring the foundations of Christianity into Europe. Because he moved the seat of the empire to Constantinople. Now there's going to be a major division in Christianity by 1054 with the Great Schism, which we haven't gotten to yet. But nonetheless, this guy really lays the foundation for the spreading of Christianity. And he actually ordered the construction of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is essentially the place where Christ was crucified and where the resurrection occurred. And eventually, 40 or 50 years after Constantine, Theodosius will finally make the emperor will finally make it official that Christianity is the faith of the Roman Empire. And you can see here the spread of Christianity, and a lot of Christianity spreads because of, like we said earlier, the roads. There's so many roads, bridges, all these types of things for Christianity to spread. Christians aren't persecuted as we roll into the 300s, really even the 200s. But nonetheless, eventually Christianity becomes the official faith, and Christianity itself will take off all over Northern Africa, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and will be the predominant faith in this area until the 600s when it has a challenger in Islam. And that wraps up this talk on ancient Rome. Appreciate you listening in, and we'll catch you next time.